slightly blushing. Thank you very much, Helmut. Thank you very much, Christoph, for having me here. It has been a very good and interesting time here. I still have another 1.5 months to go. I'm very grateful to the students' assistant and all the academic collaborators here who really helped me having a good start and finding my stuff and getting a lot of help. That has been really, really useful and helpful. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also very, very grateful for my good colleagues with whom it was nice to exchange ideas, but also to hang out. So thank you to everyone. My issue today is really when green transnational networks and the origins of European environmental policy, and I would like to take you back to the 1960s and early 1970s when environmentalism first emerged, when concerns on nature protection, on pollution became more salient and became more integrated in this new concept of the environment. Many of you have written about this. And it is a concern which unites sort of the global and the local. And in a European context, in a continent with many national borders, with many relatively small states, there, unlike, for example, in North America, there is always cross-border problems arising. So there is an inherent need for dealing with the environment that crosses borders, impacts of pollution that are on the one side of the border but were produced on the other side of the border. And we've come to be used to thinking of these European issues as issues that the European Union is dealing with, something that is considered a defining criterion of the European Union. There's actually been a debate in political science about the myth of the European Union as an environmental champion, so this is also increasingly a little bit contentious, but it is a sort of a received idea that Europe is special concerning the environment, both internally, with a lot of environmental regulation, but also internationally as an international actor promoting the fight against climate change, and you know all these aspects. But the European Union, or its predecessor, the European communities, where international cooperation on environmental issues started. In fact, it was other international organizations in Europe that contributed largely to the rise of environmental policy in Europe. Notably, the Council of Europe, this Strasbourg-based intergovernmental organization, which has a parliament there and has been very active in discussing not only nature protection issues, but also has been pioneering the emerging issues of air pollution control and water pollution in the 1960s. Notably, the polluter pays principle has been pioneered as a core principle in one of the charters they issued in '68. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which is probably a more obscure but effectively a larger international organization, it is really encompassing in this Cold War period the entire continent, has been dealing with air and water pollution issues. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, this used to be called the OEEC, which emerged out of the Marshall Plan. This is a very much research-driven organization. It is the think tank of the Western world. But also they are interested in trade, and they were also on this issue much earlier than the European communities. They set up an environmental committee in 1970, and they also were major promoters of the polluter pays principle. But why is it really that the European communities that only started an environmental policy in 1973 and that only started dealing with these environmental issues really since 1970, 1971? There were first reports by the European Parliament, and then the Commission started developing these policy issues and proposed and eventually convinced the member states to adopt this as a new policy framework, but it only eventually became a real official policy in 1987. So you have this in-between period between 73 and 87, where a lot of stuff happened, and this is really the focus of my research. But why is it really that the European communities became so important? So if we look at what political scientists write about this, for them it's relatively clear, depending on the theory they are using. A very important theory in terms of European integration is neo-functionalism, the idea that one policy actually follows from existing policies, and they argue that if you have a common market, you need common environmental regulation, because otherwise, if all individual countries set up their own policies, you erect barriers to trade, and that you don't want. So this was indeed a very important argument of the governments which discussed this. If you have a more cynical, realist international relations approach, you would say that such a policy can only emerge if the governments really, really agree on it and it's their priority. So there was a bit of a converging interest in the wake of the UN conference of 1972, which is kind of the landmark international event that hailed the new arrival of environmental policy. Many of the governments had set up their own environmental ministries. Bavaria was one of the first. And they had written reports, they had committed to these issues, so there was a bit of convergent interest. There are other approaches arguing that it's leader countries that have an interest in setting up common rules, because then you raise the prices for everyone. So if you have strict rules everywhere, it's not only the leaders who have the comparative disadvantage, and this is something that relates mainly to policy in the 1980s. Governments have an interest to shift issues to the European level. For example, when when the issue of the acid rain emerged, and the and at the national level demands arose to have strict rules for catalytic converters, notably the German government said, oh no, wait a minute, we have to agree on that at the European level, and then the process was much slower, which was partially also in the interest of the then government. And you can have institutionalist explanations. The European institutions, like any other international organization, has an interest in task expansion. They want to do more, because then they get more offices, they get more staff, they get greater importance, and they become much happier. So this is a general phenomenon among international organizations, but also among bureaucracies. It has even been heard that this is common among universities. My approach is a little different, and it is not only set apart from these international theories, international relations theories, but also from the practice of history writing about European integration, which was very much in this intergovernmentalist, realist camp, where effectively most researchers studied how one government be it the French or the British or the German, mostly the research dealt with the big ones, made European policy. And the network approach that I'm proposing here is fundamentally different in respect that it doesn't assume that one big player sets the rules and makes it all, but that it is effectively a very complex and complicated process of interaction among a variety of actors that makes this policy. So my network approach follows a bit on ideas of policy networks in policy studies and political science. It focuses on informal cooperation of a broad range of actors that are united either by shared interest or common shared ideas. Networks are characterized by recurrent interaction, and here the structure of recurrent interaction shapes trust relations and matters in this respect. The exchange of crucial resources integrates these networks. For example, information that is provided by one player is useful for another one, and thus the political actor may, for example, give access to the political process. There has been a lot of debate about epistemic communities, about networks that through their cooperation create certain a common mindset. My idea is that in this European context, transnational cooperation has a central role. Networks reach beyond borders, and there is a certain process of Europeanization, of setting up European structures. But even if network approaches focus on cooperation, this is not to say that there is no conflict in my approach. There is indeed conflicting networks that compete in their advocacy of certain policy goals. Here, I mean, this is just for illustration that what kind of different types of actors are imaginable in this. Here, you can break this down between state and societal actors, and between national actors, even subnational actors, European and international actors, and all these different kinds of actors, politicians, officials, experts, scientists, business, and NGO actors, exist at the various different levels. I mean, this is simply for illustration to map the field. My research project involves the research on these networks based on sources from different archives. I've undertaken archival research at the European level. I've looked at archives at the national level, but also at NGO sources. I've conducted interviews, and I would like to present something today on what I've so far done, namely networks in agenda setting and policy making, not so much at the outset of the policy, where probably networks connecting to international organizations play a more important role, and this is something that I still need to look into. But really in the process from 1973 until the late 1970s, where now these different actors cooperate to fill the new policy with content. And I have two different cases. One is on bird protection and one is on anti-nuclear protest. And this is effectively the image that most people in the early 1970s had in mind when they were thinking about migrant birds. There are these evil Southern Europeans who put up these nets, and they catch all the nice birds that don't end up in my garden in Northern Europe, but that get eaten and end up on a plate in Italy or France or even Belgium. And in the context of this emerging environmentalism, the media debate on bird hunting, hunting small birds, something that effectively was also practiced here until, I mean, the last bird eater was actually William II, the last emperor. It died out in the course of the 19th century, but he was a monarch, so he could do it. But it was very actively forgotten that this was something that was quite common in Northern Europe. And in the context of this new environmentalism, this new ideas come up, and there is much more of an alarm that the birds might actually be dying out. And it's very interesting to see how this gets entered into the European policy process. And in 1967, there is a written question to the European by a member of the European Parliament who says, we have to do something about bird protection, why can't the European Commission take care of this? And the European Commission writes back, this is none of our business, go ask the Council of Europe instead. And then, a couple of years later, in 1971, there are questions again, and there the European Commission then starts to take this up, and it gets entered in a small subparagraph into this new environmental action program of 1973. But how does this then end up in an effective policy? The policy that involved the Birds Directive, one of the pioneering pieces of legislation in nature protection, the Birds Directive of 1979, was actually created by a network, and this is my argument, a network that put this in the agenda and actually pushed it towards actual policy agreement. And it is really a very strange cooperation of bird protection groups and the European Parliament which played a role here. There is a very small, very marginal organization in Holland, the Stichting Mondiale Alternatief, that produces a memorandum and a petition on Save the Migrant Birds, and it sends it to all sorts of international organizations. They also send it to the European institutions, also to the European Parliament, and they argue that bird hunting is evil and that it's detrimental because it kills off, and this is an argument that goes back to the late 18th century even, it kills off the birds that are useful because they eat insects, and if we don't have these birds, we need to use more DDT, and DDT is bad, as we all know. And this gets picked up by this gentleman with the sort of strange moustache, who's a Christian Democratic member of the European Parliament, but at the same time also a member of the Bundestag. He's a special character. I can tell you more about him later. But he is very fond of bird protection. And he says, I'm using this to actually push the Commission to do something about this. They've promised to study this, but they're not doing anything in terms of legislation. So he gets the he writes a report and gets the European Parliament to enact a resolution, and while this organization wanted to hold an international conference, he says, we do practical policies, we demand binding European legislation, and this is really at the core of what the advantage of the European communities was, namely that they could enact international legislation that was binding on the member states. This is something that is very specific and a very specific legal advantage that the European communities and subsequently the European Union have. So here you see a sort of a network that is not really aware of each other. but subsequently they get in touch. The European Commission, now challenged to actually do something, commissions a report, and they ask somebody whom they already know because he's very famous. And we've heard about Jimmick already in Tom Leacon's talk earlier. He didn't only worry about Africa, he also worried about the environment in an official function as the German Chancellor's and Special Envoy for the Environment. But he had no time, so he asked his friend from the International Council for Bird Protection, who also had no time, so he asked his 2 PhD students to go out and do research on this and produce a report. The 2 PhD students went and discussed with bird protection people in Italy, and they heard very alarming things. But they didn't know how to write an academic and politically useful report. So they wrote a report that the Commission then found very difficult to deal with. For one thing, it was not very scientific in terms of the methodology, and second, it was very polemical, so they could not use this for the purposes they wanted to. And then, through a connection of a member of the International Council for Bird Protection who was actually working for the Commission, they found a former diplomat and a respected ornithologist who actually wrote a politically much more useful report for them that was also of much better scientific value. So at that time, the bird protection organizations still struggled and were not very professional. So what we find here is we have 2 different networks. Jan, this member of the European Parliament, then starts coordinating everything he does with an emerging network of different environmental groups, different radical bird protection groups. This involved the Committee Against Bird Slaughter, the Comité gegen den Vogelmord, the logo of which is this, and you can see what they're after. They exchange letters with Jimmick and the Zoological Society, so they are also domestically very active. They communicate with this organization that had submitted the original petition, and this is very much against their language, because it sounds very disparaging of the Italians, but they are really in good close cooperation with Italian bird protection organizations that are not very happy with the practices of their fellow country. At the same time, in terms of this consultation and expertise, the bird protection organizations of the more traditional kinds, those organized in the International Council for Bird Protection, the well-organized Royal Society for the Protection of Birds gets involved, and also the German Society for Bird Protection, Deutscher Bund für Vogelschutz, what is now the NABU. And in the course of the policy process, when they realize we have to do something, we have to really campaign, they set up a European organization, informal one, which later became the roots of BirdLife International. So they engage in coordinated campaigns, mainly letter writing. And so you can find tons of letters in these in the files by different authors, by individuals, by the organizations themselves, by children, very concerned letters by children. And they are directed not only to their own national governments, but also to the governments of other countries, something that some governments do not find all right, because you have to communicate with your government, not with, as a non-citizen, you're not entitled to actually write to another government. And they're very different in style. You find a lot of this environmentalist, alarmist spirit in them, and here you can see that the Committee Against the Murder of Birds actually also engaged in things as radical as boycott campaigns. And here, this is a postcard that they produced. Here, it's a children's image about hunting birds, but what they're really writing about is this find that there is now legislation coming up that prevents them for doing what they want to do, namely hunt birds. The International Council for Hunting and Game Conservation, so there is already an international organization for that, is not very effective. They are mainly noble people, and they are not too much interested in these petty bird hunters. And at the same time, they're in styles really incapable to find a good route to the European Commission as it's dealing with this. And so actually, as the organizations realize that there is hunting legislation coming from Brussels, they set up their own organization. And so you see that there is a bit of network building, but that gets institutionalized really, really quickly. And it is really this imbalance, as well as this very active campaigning, that eventually brings the governments that have been sitting together for 2 years negotiating about this and deciding not to do much, to eventually find a compromise, kick out a few birds out of the protected list of protected birds, and then find a compromise. And this is done, as I learned from an interview, very much in sync also with the bird protection organizations. They were also in touch as consulting the national governments on these issues, particularly in the British case. And so you have this new piece of nature protection legislation in 1979, an area that has very little to do with the economic community that the European economic communities effectively were, but something that laid the basis for a lot of environmental action subsequently. This piece of legislation contains habitat protection and is the basis of the 1992 Habitats Directive and the Natura 2000. So it is this very peculiar little piece of legislation that emerged very coincidentally, that had a longer term impact and laid to some extent the foundations of the EU as an environmental activist actor. So this sounds more like a story of environmentalist success. Here, the second study about anti-nuclear protest is more like an uphill struggle of the environmentalists. Nuclear power really ran in the lifeblood of the European communities. In the 1957 treaties, not only were the European economic communities set up, but also Euratom, which has been called the peaceful program for the program for the peaceful facilitation of the French nuclear bomb. So nuclear energy was really at the core of European ambitions. Nuclear energy was also treated as energy policy. It was a highly technical issue. It was very much also a secret issue, dealt with in relatively sealed off committees. It was not something discussed in public. But after 1973, with the oil crisis, it became a much more salient and much more politicized issue. There were ambitious proposals for what was called in French the trilogie nucléaire, on an ambitious program of setting up breeder reactors, doing reprocessing at the European level, and organizing waste storage. And this was supposed to be funded with EC funding and loans. Anti-nuclear protest that also emerged at that time really was happening at the sites where nuclear power plants were being built, at Fessenheim, at Wiel. These stories can also be told about other places, but it is really at Wiel that the cross-border cooperation on the Upper Rhine with Swiss activists, French activists, and German local activists that marked a new, or that looked to some of the observers as a new sort of grassroots European cooperation. And it is really the young left-wing pro-European activists such as Petra Kelly, who later became one of the founding members and central figures of the Green Party, and Jo Leinen, who later became Minister of the Environment at the Saar, and a very important European member of parliament. He's now head of the Environmental Committee. It is these people who saw these, who had a sort of a revelation when they went to Wiel that this is really the alternative Europe that we want, and it is the positive Europe from below, and we need to do something that this European, this anti-nuclear issue is really taken to the European level, and that we actually use this grassroots force to change the world towards a different economy and a different way of dealing with energy and growth. There is some overlap with another group in Brussels, which is called Agenor. It is a group, a transnational socialist group, also of a pro-European outlook, and the new European Environmental Bureau. This organization was set up as the representative of the environmental groups in Brussels as early as 1974, just 1 year after the the Environmental Action Program had been established. And it is really these young people who have overlapping membership in different groups and who are very active on these socialist / environmentalist issues, who then carry this challenge forward, if you like. They set up, they organize meetings, hearings. For example, they also they cooperate and organize a conference in Salzburg protesting against the International Atomic Energy Organization. They are in touch with Friends of the Earth and the Natural Resources Defense Council from the US. So they're also mediating a lot of ideas. Petra Kelly is personally in touch with American scientists, Goffman and other people. She's lived in the US before, so she has all these connections. And it is probably a bit of a left-wing elite network that is active there, but they are taking up concerns that resonate with broader protests in national societies. Their goal is really to challenge European and international organizations supporting nuclear power. Agenor already organized hearings in Brussels in 1975 themselves, but they realized that the pro-nuclear side will not show if it's not if they're not invited by a more official organization. So they demand from the European Commission or the European Parliament to hold public hearings for 3 reasons: to overcome this secretive, bureaucratic, technical treatment, to create public awareness, and to really challenge the pro-nuclear consensus. Their ideas fall on fertile ground because there is a commissioner at the European Commission who is sympathetic with their, or who's willing to talk, if you like. He agrees on holding hearings. Hearings is not something new, but it has been practiced, particularly on nuclear issues, since the early 1990s. 1970s. It is a standard device to diffuse process, if you like. You hold you demonstrate your willingness to talk, but then you don't do anything, and you hope that the protest will subside. But from the letters I read, there is also a little bit of hope to win over the other side. There is an idea in the letters from Brunner that he seems to believe that he can convince his opponents the eventual hearing that is organized in 1977-78 really looks more like a dialogue of the deaf. You have selected experts of the pro side, selected experts of the con side, and they are talking apart or past each other. There are also apparently political advantages. The German liberals were then the party of the environment, something we can hardly fathom today. But he actually wanted to use these hearings also as publicity for the party conference. So the role of this left-wing network of anti-nuclear activists is really to call for these hearings, to demand from the European communities to engage with this topic. Since they have a large stake in it, they might as well publicly discuss it. The organization Agenor provides actually a blueprint. They sent a letter to the commissioner and write, so this is how you do it. You set this up, you make sure that you include a broad range of participants, and you also publish the findings. And it is really very much on this blueprint that these hearings are established. The European Environmental Bureau, one of the demandeurs, becomes an official partner, and they organize the selection of the nuclear critics. They themselves engage in these hearings and raise questions. But what they also do is they facilitate access to the European officials as activists from the member states get invited. They organize social meetings so that actually there is an exchange facilitated between the remote people in Brussels, the bureaucrats, if you like, and the activists from the different national backgrounds. And they are very active in holding press conferences and press releases, and there are 2 folders of newspaper clippings from Europe. So this is also something that is covered in the public sphere. I wouldn't say that this is kind of the most relevant event, but I was surprised how broadly this has been covered. I mean, considering how difficult the European public sphere is. So the outcome was that the European Commission congratulated itself. This was something we've discussed it. So we gained legitimacy for our proposals, which also included research on new sources of energy. They declared a new willingness to learn to study waste transport, to study the link between energy consumption and growth. And this is one of the main challenges. That's not so much the technical, but more of the visions of modernity challenge that these left-wing groups were posing, namely the assumption that growth will go on forever and that energy consumption will be constantly rising is flawed. And at the same time, the European Environmental Bureau is accepted as a partner. They become much more institutionalized in future consultation, and it remains to be studied to what extent this was actually the case. The European Environmental Bureau, now in this privileged role, was generally happy with the results, but they continued their critique on the energy perspectives and the reprocessing. processing, or but this is also something that cannot be expected in a situation where among the governments and among the institutions you have such an overwhelming consensus, a pro-nuclear consensus. What I find interesting here is really that they're willing to open up and that this consensus gets challenged. And it's interesting how these groups tackle this very remote bureaucratic institution. So that is at the core of it. It's not really policy change that this network is at, but it's really a slight reconsideration of attitude and a willingness to open up and discuss. So what do we learn when we look back at these two examples? What do we learn about the European community's emerging environmental policy? I would argue that we can see that networks provide a link to society, to societal concern, and put them into the policy process. This you can see with bird protection, which is a public concern, and I found a letter from the German Foreign Ministry that writes, "This is such an important public concern that this is in our national interest to push for this," and that I found quite strong. And you find that in this emerging situation of a new policy, that the European institutions that have this image of being remote and bureaucratic and very distant were actually quite open and willing to fill the policy with contents that actually came from outside. And here, this is also, of course, an example of the task extension that I mentioned earlier. What do we learn about networks? The networks that we find here are astonishingly transnational, but sometimes have a national core. I mean, the members of the Young European Federalists who were very active in this were all Germans, for example. What matters in terms of the impact of the network is really the willingness of the European institutions to cooperate, access matters. Resources also matter, the expertise that groups can amass, the institutional knowledge, and here Petra Kelly was really an asset because she worked as an official in Brussels and she knew many people and she knew how the institutions worked, and so she was able to help others with writing to the right person. Time is important, and activism, really getting all these people to write these letters. So it's really classical social movements qualifications, if you like. And what is really interesting, if you're looking at this through time, and this is something you cannot, that is not so much present in social movement research, is really how these networks adapt. They quickly start to Europeanize, set up European representations, and they also start learning. The example of this expertise completely gone wrong is something that probably didn't happen afterwards. And what do we learn about the environment from this case? When I look back at what I've written, it looked more like I'm mainly dealing with policy. I'm not dealing so much about with the environment. So what I find very interesting regarding the environment as the contents of this is that what you find in the literature about the alarmist environmentalism of the 1970s, this sense of urgency, this sense of fear, is something that is very, very present in these debates. There is the fear of the extinction of the birds, there is the fear of DDT and other chemicals, pesticides that will kill us all, and then there is the doomsday fear of nuclear radiation. Petra Kelly is very obsessed with cancer. She had lost her sister to cancer, and since that, cancer is everywhere. These are partially realistic, partially overblown something that is really characteristic of the vision of the environment of the time. And what is also very interesting is that in terms of the environment and environmentalism, in both cases we find a challenge to the standard post-war vision of modernity. It is really the challenge to the idea of growth, the challenge of the idea of an ever more industrialized and ever more technical solution-based society. This is radical in rhetoric, and it seems a little more practical if you look at the latter exchanges, and more pragmatic on the practical side in terms of the cooperation with the European institutions. And it remains to be seen to what extent these challenges to the nuclear consensus, as well as the legislation on birds. This legislation is famous that it's the worst implemented of all pieces of European legislation, but whether this really wrought change concerning the action. Thank you very much.